So, ladies and gentlemen, bonsoir. We are delighted to welcome you to the first on-site event of Alliance Française since March 2020. Tonight, French Talk is a recurring event that has been going on since 2018, except from tomorrow onwards. This event is not going to be called French Talks anymore, it's going to be called Monday Talks. And French Talks, it's a portal for dialogues between Malaysian and French experts on topics ranging from arts to environment. But before we proceed with tonight's topic, I would like to invite His Excellency, the Ambassador of France to Malaysia, Mr. Roland Galarag, to say a few words.
So good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, not only because this is the first such session after umpteenth number of days, but also for me personally, because this is the first time, actually, I'm attending one of those since I have arrived in Malaysia last year in October. We just heard French Talks to become Monday Talks, subsequently Tuesday Talks, and then we have, you see, a path of ahead of us, is about discussing together issues of common interests. And I will, of course, leave the floor immediately to our guests. We are very fortunate to have them tonight. But I just want to stress in 2 seconds why this year's theme, protection of the rainforest, is actually a theme of common interest. It's quite obvious, actually, because rainforest is part of the heritage of Malaysia. It's absolutely key also for the global balance of the climate, and in that respect also key to us in France, to the extent that we just adopted a law regarding imported deforestation. I will stop at that. I'm no expert, and I will leave the floor to our experts tonight. We're very fortunate to have a representative of Greenpeace, as you can see, and also Dr. Djama, who will explain about a very interesting project which we are sponsoring, and our friend here from, I've already forgotten the name of the tree after which your blog is named, but you know the name. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Ottilia, will you be introducing?
I was going to introduce, but I think the ambassador already did. I was just going to introduce tonight's talk with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that I thought it's very suitable. And he said, "What we are doing to the forests of the world, it's a mirror reflection to what we are doing to ourselves and to one another." So as His Excellency mentioned, tonight's talk is about the forests today and tomorrow. And as also he mentioned, we have a Malaysian and French specialists to talk about the project. Public engagement campaigner from Greenpeace, Ms. Noor Shakina. And from France, Professor Marcel Djama from CIRAD. And moderating tonight's talk is Mr. Yao Hua Lau, who is a freelance science journalist. So I'll pass now the microphone to Mr. Yao Hua to initiate the discussion.
Thank you, His Excellency and Ottilia, for that introduction. I think before we start talking about forests, forests today and what about tomorrow, before we start discussing what exactly are forests and what we can do to realize our visions of forests for Malaysia and the world, I think we'll start off by having our guest here do a bit of a presentation to lay the foundation or the framework for our forum tonight. So we'll start off with Marcel, who's going to do a presentation on his project.
Okay. So, good evening, all. So, I've been asked to present very briefly research project, a research and development project we are working on, trails, climate resilient landscape for wildlife conservation. This is a project that is sponsored by the French Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, and led by the Embassy of France in Malaysia. And this is a project on innovative planting design for wildlife, climate and livelihood. So I will go very briefly through the project, because we are going to have a conversation later, just presenting what is it, where it's happening, who is in charge and involved in the project, and so on. A few slides only. So the next one, it's where it's happening. So this project is actually being implemented in Sabah, in the Kinabatangan area. Sabah, you are quite familiar with it in Malaysia. It's Eastern Malaysia, Borneo. This is an area where the expansion of oil palm monoculture is quite intensive, quite important, and which is facing deforestation and degraded area degraded forest due to this situation. So next slide. That was aware, and this is what we are doing with Trails project. So Trails project is not addressing deforestation per se, because of the context actually in Sabah. We are trying to implement a landscape restoration approach. So landscape restoration approach is the process of regaining ecological functioning and enhancing human well-being across deforested or degraded forest landscape. So Trails aims at addressing these issues, the potential of oil palm-based agroforestry to address sustainable farming, to address biodiversity conservation, climate change issues, and of course community livelihoods and well-being in this area. So we are implementing this approach on landscape restoration. So next, please. So who is doing this program? Who is involved in it? We are building on a complementary partnership with public stakeholders. So the French representative of French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. French has European, they have a strong concern on it because of, as the ambassador say, the implementation of more and more no deforestation supply chain in Europe for commodities. Sabah authorities and agencies are involved in the project, and the implementers are a consortium of partners from academics, CIRAD and University Putra Malaysia, from the public sector and the grower, Melanking Oil Palm Plantation, and NGO conservation, a conservation NGO, Hutan, who is established in Sabah for years now, for 20 years at least. So we are trying to mobilize and integrate various science fields. So this is a pluridisciplinary program, mobilizing agronomists, foresters, vets, ecologists, anthropologists, social scientists, economists in the project. One of the specificities of our activity is that we are not inventing things from scratch. We are there to support existing local initiatives, and we are there also to support actors like the MOPP plantation, who is asking our support, our technical support to turn to agroforestry and to turn to agroecology activities, but also supporting local initiatives from local communities who are there. And the idea is to strengthen dialogues between the multiple initiatives existing to address livelihood issues and conservation issues as well, and best farming practices too, to strengthen dialogues between stakeholders and to promote synergies between these multiple activities in the local setting. Next, after why this program on the restoration? So the main issue is that in degraded areas, reforestation of wildlife corridors is key, is very important to preserve the declining biodiversity to potentially increase and enhance the biodiversity potentials, and to address also environmental issues or climate change issues as well. However, of course, many business operators, especially growers, they are quite reluctant to implement this agroforestry approach, because for many reasons. The main of it is, of course, because of the financial burden and the loss of economic opportunities by maintaining or preserving some land areas for reforestation, so and optimizing the land use. Also because they consider that this reforestation activities is promoting pest invasions, developing conflict between wildlife and human populations. And so for all these reasons, it's actually not a really popular way of addressing the situation. But in other countries, the potential for agroforestry, including in palm oil, especially in Latin America, for example, in Colombia and Brazil, is quite impressive. And we have this, actually, we start having economics and agronomic references about how trees and various species of trees and oil palm trees can coexist and be quite productive as well. So the next. So our approach is that we are implementing what we call a landscape approach. I won't go far into this conceptual type of approach, which is also not only conceptual, actually it's quite straightforward. But it's more or less, to me, there is a French research tradition, what we call développement local, local development or territorial development. And this is the type of approach that we are trying to deal. The idea is to move beyond the supply chain, beyond one crop, one commodity. Most of the time when we talk about agricultural development, we are focused on, especially here in Malaysia, on one crop, mostly palm oil issues, etc. So we consider that in a territory, there is many activities coexisting, sometimes conflicting, sometimes not, and we are trying to address all the resources that a population living in the same territory can mobilize. Some of these resources could be market-oriented, but some not. For example, preserving water, this is a public good. Having a non-polluted river is a public good that may interest some of the population there. And this is something that we can address also through that kind of lands, which take into account the territory and not only a specific supply chain or a production system. And what we are doing is experimenting. So we are merging different initiatives. The main one is working with MOPP plantation to experiment this oil palm-based agroforestry, mixing different species of trees with palm oil. And we are trying to address the kind of oil palm performance that can come up from this approach. And at the same time, we are developing another set of activities towards the local communities and the neighborhood of the plantation on developing the potential for ecosystem services, payments, or non-market ones, and see what kind of socioeconomic gains can be provided to local communities. So the next slide. So in terms of research, we are engaging a wide range of monitoring and surveys on oil palm performance within the plantation area, of course, growth, yields, structure of the vegetables, combination of the mixed cropping. We are monitoring the biodiversity status within these new reforested areas. So what kind of species are coming back? Are they recolonizing? Are they coming back to this habitat that is being restored? We are looking at the socioeconomic benefits that can be provided by these new production systems for the plantation. For example, are they what are the costs and benefits for the growers to mix this type of croppings, but also for the local communities, what type of economic gain, what type of activities they can merge from that. Ecotourism is being one of them, not actually because of the pandemic, but it has been an activity already engaged in this location for some years. And we are looking at well-being, which is something which is a little bit far beyond just economic livelihoods, and this is actually a sense of living in a place and appreciating a way of life, appreciating a landscape, appreciating some of the services that can be provided by these resources. And of course, climate resilience, carbon storage, etc. So a set of survey. Next step, which is I think the last one, what we are trying to give you as a motto going back home is that it's really important to cherish the landscape. And if we can address this by restoring what has been degraded and regaining some ecological functionality and some other environmental amenities, that's actually what we are trying to address. This is not Malaysia, but it's a landscape quite close to it, and some of your French community may know where it's coming from. It was a place I was living for a long time before being in Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel, for that. So obviously, Marcel has laid the groundwork for us to understand that a forest in its natural form, it's a multitude of things, ecosystem services, and it can also provide, we can provide economy to the local communities. It can be many things. And even when it's transformed into an oil palm plantation, there are ways, there are attempts to try to return it to a state where it can provide some of those ecological services. We'll talk more about that later, but we'll first watch a video, I guess, presented by Sakina.
Yeah, I just want to intro a bit. So the video is a very short video about Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve and the degazettement that's going on. I just want to give a bit of intro because in the video there's going to be a character named Damai, so that everyone is not confused. Damai is a tree, and it's just a way that we do the storytelling. So Damai will be narrating the video. You can play it.
Hello everyone, it's me again, Damai, and this time I'm back to talk about why we need to defend nature reserves like our family of forests, because many of us are disappearing now. In the 1960s, an important group of our guardians began taking us for granted in the name of progress. As a consequence, our way of life for many members of my family, from little creatures to indigenous people, were destroyed by our guardians for the sake of one thing: profit. The most recent example, Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve, or KLNFR for short. It's a home to precious wildlife, indigenous tribes, and some of my tree cousins. Kuala Langat is located in the southwestern part of Selangor, and the forest reserve itself is considered to be one of the oldest life-giving peatland forest reserves in West Malaysia. They've been around for more than 8,000 years and was gazetted as a forest reserve since 1927. You can find a number of vital guardians living here. One of the important guardians are the Orang Asli, who have lived with us on this land for more than 100 years. KLNFR is a major green lung in Selangor, and as a peat swamp forest, it is one of the most efficient natural carbon sinks on the planet. While helping to reduce climate change, it also provides safe drinking water and minimizes flood risk. Unfortunately, the tribes of forest life are now facing a challenging time. Their livelihood and those living within and around the forest reserve are at risk of being deforested. The Selangor state government proposed to degazette 97% of the forest reserve for development projects, which will release about 5.5 million tons of carbon dioxide. This goes against Malaysia's Paris Agreement commitment to a reduction of greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030. The voices of over 45,000 people standing to protect my family of forests were raised in objection to the degazettement of Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve. But more is needed to completely prevent the degazettement, and we stand a better chance if we work together. We must all continue the fight too. Lend your voice, speak up for Orang Asli rights, stand up to protect this forest where my family lives.
Okay, so the video is self-explanatory. Lend your voice, it says. Right, so, well, now we can formally start our forum. Good evening. His Excellency started his introduction by saying that we are talking about rainforest today because it is a heritage of Malaysia. And he's definitely right about that. Of course, about 100 years ago, Peninsular Malaysia, the whole of Malaysia, including the Borneo side, it's all forested. Even up till 50 years ago, well, in the 1950s, Peninsular Malaysia, where we are now, is still about 70% to 80% forested. Now, if you read the accounts of the British explorers or the scientists at the time, they'll say that from the heart of Kuala Lumpur, you just need to drive out 30 minutes. And you can imagine how slow the cars were at the time. And you hit a forest so thick, you cannot penetrate it. You don't get that now within 30 minutes. It's very difficult. But to say that it is a heritage of Malaysia, the word heritage actually conjures up different meaning for different people and for different communities. Based on what Marcel has showed us and what Sakrina has showed us, a forest could be many, many different things. The indigenous communities who live there could claim it as their heritage, but perhaps so could the government of the day and claim it as their economic heritage, their right to develop it as they see fit. So what we're going to discuss today is really what is the identity of forest today and for tomorrow. And with all these different voices that we have about forest, how can we as individuals actually, what can we do to realize our vision for the forest that we want it to be? So to kick, to start the ball rolling, I would just like to gauge how familiar our audience is with forests in Malaysia. Let's see. Between federal and state governments, who control the forest? For those who say the federal government controls the forest, please raise your hand. For those who say the state governments control the forest, please raise your hand. Oh, okay. Wait, was the answer already revealed in the videos? Okay, you guys know that, which is surprising to me because actually many Malaysians do not know that. Okay, let's just start talking about forest then. Sakina, why don't we start with you? In Malaysia, we say that we know that it's the state governments that have a say over forest land. How much say do they have? Let's take the Kuala Langat example. In the video it says de-gazette. What does it mean to de-gazette? And if the forest, what does it mean to, if the forest is de-gazetted, is it no longer a forest? What does it mean?
So that particular forest, Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve, like mentioned in the video, has been gazetted as a forest reserve since 1927. So what it means that they want to de-gazette it is that they didn't give much detail actually. So state government of Selangor wanted to de-gazette, and then they just said it's for mixed development. It's very, very shady. We don't know really what kind of development it's going to be, whether it's going to be highway, public transport, or just residential area or whatever. Yeah, so what it means is, yes, once it's de-gazetted, it can be deforested and then, anything done to it.
So the word de-gazette is actually a legal term then, right? It's a legal term. So in Malaysia, if we read the, every time an officer announces how many forests Malaysia has, right now they would say that Malaysia has, do you guys, what's the forest cover of Malaysia? 55. 54 is more correct. For the whole of Malaysia, the official number is that 54% of Malaysia's land is forested. Now that forest doesn't mean that it is filled with trees. It just means that the legal status of the land is forest. It means that in the district office, in the land office, if you look at the land title, the use is forest. That means it's a forest according to official numbers. So if you can go there and there's not a single tree, but it'll still count into the forest tally if the land title says so. But of course that means on the other hand, you can have a forested land, but the use is for residential, then the forestry department doesn't count that. So remember that in mind, bear that in mind, because when we compare forests between satellite images and the official count, many people will say that it makes no sense because the satellite shows much less, whereas the official numbers is much higher. There are arguments for both sides. So that just know that in Malaysia, when the government says it's forest, they really mean the legal status of the land. So which means that if they de-gazette it, it will go from a forest use land to a non-forest use land, but the trees could still be there. So those are two different things. But is that a bad thing to classify a forest based on the legal status of the land?
I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but maybe I'll give a bit more context. Like you mentioned, it could be forest and then inside is actually different, or like it could be degazetted but maybe they haven't developed yet.
Yep.
So actually, according to Forest Act 1984, the permanent forest reserve actually have a few different subcategories in there.
Yep.
And one of the few categories are timber production forests. So they say under sustainable acquisition, which is supposed to be so not clear-cut logging, so selective logging. However, usually even if it's in the law, the enforcement is not very strong. So what happens is it might be, not really selective logging after all, even though it's supposed to be that way. Yeah, so that's unfortunate.
There are many terms that Sakina has mentioned. I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with those terms. So if you have gone around Malaysia, you will see signboards of, next to the forest, you might see signboards showing Hutan Simpan Kekal, or HSK. That's what we call permanent forest reserves. And what Sakina just described is the fact that about 60% of Peninsular Malaysia's forest reserves can be logged. And this is, as she described, it should be sustainable logging. They have strict rules, but whether it's always enforced, now that's a different question. Of course, if you ask the forestry officers, and I have, and they will say, it is enforced, but there are always some slack there. What about a forest? That's the legal status of the forest, right? What about forest as an ecological entity? Marcel, can you tell us about, from that aspect, what are some of the ecosystem services that a forest should provide, a healthy forest should provide? Compared to, I guess, a degraded forest, whatever degraded forest would mean. Yeah.
That's not what they should provide, that's what they are providing actually. So services are huge actually. Of course, you have the economics one, timber, this is the most obvious. And this is what attracts most interest by economic operators.
So you consider the timber an ecological service too?
No, we're talking about services. Timber is not an ecological service. I was talking about services at large first. Yeah. Now if we go to ecological services, of course, there are many regulating the climate, regulating water, regulating pollinizations and pollinators, regulate water stream, water rivers, carbon storage. I'm probably missing some points. So that's quite interesting because when we go, for example, to the definition of forest, actually, of course, most of the countries, the way they categorize, going back to the previous conversation you had, the definition of a forest is always political. And most of the time, it's not focused on the ecological functions of the forest. Most of the time, the classification is based on, is that for production or not? Could it be gazetted or not? Should it be protected or not? Nowadays, at the international level, there is new metrics trying to introduce actually a definition of the forest in terms of ecological services. Not only ecological services. For example, one of the metrics that is used by European suppliers when they want to implement what they call their non-deforestation policies, of course, they know that they cannot rely only on country's definition in terms of forest because it's changing from country to another one. And of course, NGOs are quite, they are watching very carefully the sourcing situation. So these new metrics, for example, like the high conservation value forest, they are taking into account many values of the forest, classifying. So ecological services, ecological values are one, economic values are one, but you have also cultural values, heritage, patrimoine, how local communities could be dedicated to their forests as a sacred site or something like that is taking into account for the definition of a forest. And more recently, you have some other metrics that have been implemented, like the high carbon stock forest, which main focus is the ecological function. And this is the forest has a carbon storage. Its capacity to store carbon. And not all forests have the same capacity to do that. So the idea is not only to look at how the land cover is organized or what type of planting you have in it, but how this actually forest is storing in terms of carbon, which is quite important for climate change mitigation, for example. So yeah, there is plenty of ecological services, and ecological services are even numbering are more important than the economics one when we look at them in terms of numbers of services that are provided, but also in terms of impact on how our planet is working actually and living. I should add here that if you have questions, you can save it till the end. We have a Q&A session at the end. You mentioned that the ecological services of a forest, a healthy forest, exceeds the economic value, I guess, or the economic production that the forest can give. I'm not sure that's generally accepted, because when it comes to quantifying these values of the forest, right? I mean, I think you have more of an economic background than I do, but I think it's very easy to, for example, I'm a journalist, and when I look at forest numbers, it's very easy to get the numbers on the royalty that the loggers would pay the states, the export value of the timber. It's very easily to compare those, and the state governments can easily control those. I want more money, then I will log more. If I don't need that much money, I'm not sure if that ever happens, then they will log less. But then when it comes to those ecological services, is it easily quantifiable? I know there are attempts to quantify it, but at what stage are we? Is it really reliable? Like, based on your experience in Malaysia, do the state governments accept this quantification of ecological service when they, sort of like do their account of their forest? I don't know if they accept or not. You should ask to officers for that. But what I can say is there is plenty of work in environmental economics, quantifying actually the ecological services provided. So, and they are huge, of course. You have these famous studies from the British economist. I just forgot his name now, but who were quantifying the cost not only of forests but ecological services, and cost of opportunities of that. It was something like 50 billion of US dollar over some years. But yeah, I think it's, if you look at the cost for the collectivity, present, future, the cost of opportunities of mitigating some of the services provided, also the cost of degradation that is implemented. For example, you can log a forest, but if you pollute a river, there is a cost for most of the users of this river who cannot fish anymore.
We see that happening a lot in Malaysia. You say you log the forest, pollute the river, and then all the users would suffer.
Of course.
In fact, we almost get this like major flooding every few years. In fact, some of the northeastern states, they say it's yearly now. But still, we don't see the state government, or I guess the people who are in charge, say otherwise. You know, they will still be saying that it is not the logging that causes the flood. The floods happen everywhere. So it seems quite hard to persuade them or to convey this message to them, although you have said there's a lot of work done on this. So Sakina, like example, like the Kuala Langat example, right? You see, so it's a peat swamp forest, a good carbon sink, and it has been gazetted as a forest since 37, right?
1927.
27. Okay, so almost a century now. But they are planning to de-gazette it and supposedly developing it into, I think, a mixed development like shopping mall.
Still very vague right now. They're not telling the details of it.
Okay, but it's going to be concrete on it for sure.
Probably.
Probably. Okay. Okay. You're playing it safe there. What I've heard, what I've read is that it's going to be concrete on it, and so in that case, then, what's your take on the state government's, I guess, mentality about that? You know, they have to decide if they want to keep this piece of land as a forest, or they want to develop it and unlock the land value, because it's, after all, it's in Selangor. It's valuable, right? Yeah. And they say they're going to replace it with, in fact, just this morning in the news, the government said they're going to replace it with better forest. I'm not...
There's no replacing it. It's 8,000 years old. There's not going to be any comparable forest to it. They say they're going to replace, but also when we did go for a public hearing on the issue in September. So during the hearing, they listed out a few potential replacement forests, which are nowhere near, I mean, obviously it's not a peat forest, first of all, and it's segregated, so it's not even one piece of big forest. So that's going to be an issue, like wildlife corridors. So, you know, all that we hear in the news lately, also a lot of wildlife have been getting hit by cars on the highways. This is the problem when they need to move between segregated forests. So a bigger piece is obviously better.
They're going to take away a bungalow and replace it with several huts all scattered throughout.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then going back to your, about the quantifying, I think that's the problem. Like, we're so obsessed with quantifying everything. And then the problem is also that it's, like we mentioned earlier, the state government is the one that controls the forest. And then the federal government controls, you know, the other stuff. So sometimes, like the effect of the deforestation is not really on state governments, let's say, their responsibility. So they probably don't care so much. I mean, it's sad to say, but yeah, when it's not directly under them. So let's say the river pollution, like take example of Kim River. When that happens, who went down and take care of the problem? It's the ministry, right? So that's federal. So the state government, not so much. So some of those effects might not directly affect state governments. So because of this segregation, it does create a problem that there's kind of a selfish divide there, whether, you know, we want the money for state government because state government wants to develop the state, but you know, so the effects doesn't really touch them. So the effects is like being mitigated by federal. Although federal have all these really good legislations about forests that state government doesn't want to follow per se. Yeah.
I think we should also note here that Malaysia, the federal government of Malaysia, has sort of like a pledge to the international community to keep 50% of our land under forest cover. And it was made, the pledge was sort of made in 1992 in conjunction with the Rio Summit. But it was never put into, it was never put on paper. So there's not a single government document that mentions that 50%. It was always just repeated verbally. And in fact, every government since has at least one minister paying tribute to that 50%. And it's only just a couple of months ago, or last month, that they finally came up with a national forest policy that specifically mentions this 50%. And that's, you know, on part of the federal government. But it still remains a policy, and the real authority lies with the state. It would be great to be able to maintain 50% of Malaysia under forest cover, which is actually quite an achievement. I just checked. Do you guys know what's the forest cover of France? 30? 5? Oh, that's dismal. That's very pessimistic. But the one I saw, it's actually 30%. At least that's 2010 figures. It's about 30% of France is forest cover. But only 0.2% is primary forest. In Malaysia, it's more about 54% forest cover and 14% primary forest. So that's a point of pride for many of the foresters. They say that despite all this development, we still have this much. But the trend shows that we are declining. It's declining slowly. You know, our forest loss is not as great as before, but it's still losing. And as for a long time, one of the main drivers of deforestation has been oil palm. But as Marcel showed, there are ways to enable oil palm plantations to also be, I guess, biodiversity rich. So Marcel, the endeavor that you just described with trails, right? You know, doing agroforestry, would you say that's a common approach, or even an approach that is welcomed in Malaysia, in your experience, as you know, as you carry out this project? Do you face obstacles, you know, trying to do agroforestry in oil palm, or do you find that they welcome this approach?
There is no real obstacle. I think there is a lack of interest of most of the growers, mm-hmm. For many reasons. Main being that most of them are quite comfortable with doing business as usual. They don't want to change, or they change under some market pressure, like when they go for certification or something like that. Some companies, some growers are willing to experiment that, but that will be on the long term, of course. And there is, again, this trade-off between short gains and investing on the future. So some growers, MOPP being one of them, are betting on the future because they consider that moving beyond certification per se, meaning moving beyond classical sustainable management and trying to have a coexistence with their neighborhood and with the wildlife could also be of some benefits, of economic benefits in the future. They were thinking, for example, having a kind of a labeling on the wildlife-friendly farming, for example, which is one of their dreams.
So when they say wildlife, what are we talking about? What wildlife are we talking about here?
They are talking mostly about the type of wildlife they used to have conflict with. Orangutans and elephants, mostly elephants.
Okay,
actually.
elephants. Right.
Yeah. But of course, ecologists, they are dealing with a broader range of wildlife. In terms of research, what is quite interesting, and in terms of environmental challenge as well, is that when the area are degraded, you have to find solution. And the main solution is first to maintain the existing biodiversity. Orangutans are dying, not only them, they are the most emblematic, but you have a lot of species who are on an extinction trend. And then trying to find a way to reintroduce them, to reaccommodate them with the new types of habitats that are left for them is something quite important. More generally, at the international level, you have a growing interest for ecosystem restoration. You have big international initiatives like the Bund Challenge and many of them supported by the UN, where the idea is to actually restore degraded areas, because restoration can, some of the research, they show that, for example, 80% of the biodiversity can recolonize these degraded areas. So the challenges are there. So actually what we are doing in this trail project, there is two ways of approaching the situation. One is going to try to attract volunteers, farmers, to try to implement what you think is good for them and something like that. Another way is just working with the people who are asking you to come and work with them, because this is where initiatives are existing, that most of the time there is a lack of support to these initiatives. Right. And I mean, if we can provide some kind of research support to them, some kind of research resources to reach these candidates for change, it can make the difference. So that's what we are betting on with this trail project at a small level. But the idea is also to provide references that will be upscale in the next future.
Sure. So that's definitely what researchers can do to provide the evidence, right, on what could work and what could not work. No, I think so far what we have established is really that forest itself is a very complex entity with many different values for many different people.